Good evening. Today is the 13th day of July 2022, and we are here with our beloved Ranga to share the life divine with you. This is the beginning of Book 2, The Knowledge and the Ignorance, the Spiritual Evolution. Now, Part 1 is the Infinite Consciousness and the Ignorance. And we are in Chapter 1, Indeterminates, Cosmic Determinations, and the Indeterminable, at page 325. Beginning with the line, "But if the Supreme Absolute is indeed a pure indeterminable," and before we begin, I would just like to thank Nilisha Mehta for carrying on the work with Ranga when I was away for nearly 3.5 months. She's done a good job. Let us begin.
So, since we are in the middle of the chapter somewhere, we have to have a reference of what he is speaking about. So, I begin by a summary of the previous para. Then we get the sense of continuity. Between the higher mind and the overmind, on all these higher planes, we find a sharp dichotomy of Purusha and Prakriti, a supreme state of impersonal, featureless silence of immobility, nirvana, nirguna Brahman, and a saguna Brahman with infinite qualities, who has entered into all the forms and shapes of the universe and gives them features, characteristics. Okay? But the overmind consciousness holds them both together, not as contraries, but as complementaries. If man pursues the nirguna to its ultimate, he meets the absolute, void of all relations, all features, the ultimate transcendence. If man pursues the personal, the saguna, he meets the Purushottama, a personal divine master of the universe, creating and governing it with absolute power and control. So, obviously, there must be another level that goes beyond the dichotomy, the duality, the contrariety. Srimda is not satisfied with truth being divided into two. He wants absolute oneness. So obviously, there must be another level that goes beyond the dichotomy, the duality, the contrariety. But what could that be which harmonizes such fundamental opposites? That's a question he has raised in the previous para. Now we read the next para. I think also we'll have a brief discussion on what is the indeterminable, what is the determinates and the indeterminates. When you speak of a determinate, you mean something which has got determined characteristics. Everything in the physical world can be described. Maybe not fully, but you can describe it. You can say its form, shape, weight, color, etc., etc. So, you can define it. But when you define something, you are limiting it to its qualities. But the divine creativity cannot be limited. It has to be unlimited, because it must be capable of producing everything it wants. Therefore, it must start from an indeterminable, that is to say, something which is absolutely featureless but has got the power to create features. So that is the indeterminable. You can't describe the divine in any way. The moment you describe him and give characteristics to him, you are limiting him. If you say he is omnipotent, sounds wonderful, but you are limiting him. Because he can be, if he wants, the opposite of omnipotent. He can be the weakest thing he wants. He can grade his, or he can even deny his omnipotence and become the opposite. He can be omniscient, but he has the capacity to be the opposite of himself. So you can't describe him in any way. The moment you describe him, then you are limiting him. There are many religions which say Allah is great, Allahu Akbar, he is great. But he can also be small and insignificant. So nobody puts that on the windscreen of their car. They only say Allah is great. Or the Christians put God is great. But he can be also very insignificant if he wants to be. So that is the indeterminable. You can't give any features to him. The moment you do that, you are limiting him, whereas he is unlimited. Now, the indeterminable, ultimate indeterminable, is creating determinates. Because in the physical world, everything is determined. You have characteristics. Everything can be described. Maybe you can't describe it fully, like the Jaina philosophy says. That you can't describe anything fully. You can say it's got this color, it's got this color, it is this weight, made of this stuff, this stuff. Even the positives you will never be able to complete. Then you have to say what it is not. It is not this, it is not this, it is not this. So that's why the Jaina philosophy says that even physical forms in the world, you can never describe fully. Syadva, na syadva. Okay. It can be, it may not be. So, this is what he is saying in this para. And as it keeps coming down, there is that which is, there are grades in which it comes down. So, if you take any one place, okay, I'll begin with an example, then it will be easy to understand. Let's take molten metal. Okay. Purified iron ore, it has got no form. It's just in a liquid form, and it has no form as yet. But I can cool it and I can make metal sheets out of it. I have given it a form. Or I can make wires out of it. Or I can make railway tracks out of it. So that is the determinate. The indeterminate is the molten metal without form and characteristics to a certain extent. Now I give it a plate. It's a plate. So there is a form. Or I can do this, or I can do that. I can make it a wire, I can make it this. So that's it. So if I call the plate and the wires and all these things, if I call it, let's say I call it level 10. Okay. The one before that is level 9. And the one below that. Now, that wire also, I can make many types of wires. I can make wires for electricity. I can make thin wires for electricity. I can make thick wires like that for suspension bridges. So again, there are so many different types of wires even. So that is again level 10. The one above is level 9. The one below is level 11. But 11 can also become 12 and all that. So just we'll take 3. Level 10 is a determinate. Level 9 is the indeterminate of that form.
So the molten metal has a form.
Yeah, but I'm taking it as a middle stage.
Right.
I can go back even more, until finally I reach the indeterminable. So I'm taking just to explain the principle of what he's saying. We'll also go into another example, but this is what's so. So when he says indeterminate and determinate, level 10 is the determinate of the level 9 indeterminate. The molten metal is indeterminate, and the one which is, I'm making plates and wires and all that, that is level 10, which is determinate. Now, this also can become the indeterminate of something which is below itself. So, it goes on creating more and more determinates, until finally in the physical world, you have infinite determinates. A chair can be described as far as possible so that people will understand. So this is the scheme of what he's saying. It starts from something formless, featureless, immutable, and it starts making forms, and giving characteristics until finally you have everything here. Maybe a good example, better example will be if you take the fertilized cell. Okay, it could be a tree, it could be the seed of a tree, it can be a human seed, it can be an animal seed. As soon as it's fertilized, it's one, but it breaks itself into two. Then that 2 breaks itself into 4. Then that 4, it goes by geometric progression. Okay? Then it becomes 8, 16. But at some stage, they will start putting on the characteristics of what they are ultimately going to be. So that one cell can become bone tissue, it can become muscle tissue, it can become teeth tissue, it can become retina sensitive tissue, cartilage tissue if you want, so many different types. So at some stage they have not yet become bone tissue, but it is a determinant, it can become bone tissue. But once it becomes bone tissue, it can't become something else. So this is a chapter, this is what it is describing. Okay, so starts from the indeterminable, becomes more and more determinate, and in a relative way, that which is above is an indeterminate of that which is determinate. And the determinate itself becomes a indeterminate of that which is to follow. So this is the process. Until finally you have a human being or a living creature with bone tissue, with muscle tissue, with teeth tissue, with hair tissue, all the differentiation and the determinations have taken place.
So the determinate can become indeterminate.
Yes. Not can become, but it can be considered as the indeterminate form of something to come below it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Yeah, that's right. We can take also the example of animals. Okay? Life itself is the indeterminate, but life can take many, many forms. Okay? Life itself is prana, energy, but it can become a storm, it can become a living creature, it can become the mammal family. Now, if you take the mammal family, there are, I think usually there are 5, mammal family. Many. Cats, horses, wolves, dogs, etc. Each one again, if you take only the cat family, it can become a lion, it can become a tiger, it can become a lynx, it can become a leopard, it can become a snow leopard, so many different types. And again there, individual variation will be there within one family. So there is no end to this process of determinations. If you take similarly the cats, okay, you can have Persian cats, you can have all sorts of different cats, okay, or you can have dogs also, the Pomeranians and Alsatians and whatnot. So this is basically what he's saying in the chapter. But he goes into great detail. Now, after this little introduction, we will read what he is saying in the next para. But if the Supreme Absolute. It seems we have already read it, so I'll go with each sentence. But if the Supreme Absolute is indeed a pure indeterminable, then no creation, no manifestation, no universe is possible. So why does he say that? Because the Supreme Absolute is immutable. We must remember that it's immutable. And if it is immutable, it can't take any forms. Okay, this is a very interesting argument. He is going to justify the need and the presence of supermind. He is going to justify that. If the Supreme Absolute is indeed a pure indeterminable, then no creation, no manifestation, no universe is possible. Very clear, because the Supreme Absolute is featureless, immutable. If it is immutable, it can't mutate itself into any form. Okay, so that's the first one. And yet, the universe exists. Logic is saying it can't exist, but physically we see that the universe exists, so there must be an explanation. What then is it that creates this contradiction, is able to effect the impossible, bring this insoluble riddle of self-division into existence? A power of some kind it must be. And since the Absolute is the sole reality, the one origin of all things, this power must proceed from it, must have some relation with it, a connection, a dependence. For if it is quite other than the Supreme Reality, a cosmic imagination imposing its determinations on the eternal blank of the indeterminable, then the sole existence of an absolute Parabrahman is no longer admissible. Then there is then a dualism at the source of things, not substantially different from the Sankhya dualism of soul and nature. Okay, let's look at the sentence. He's saying, since there is a creative power, logic says if it is immutable, it can't create. But we see that there is so we must find a solution to this riddle. So, a power of some kind it must be. Any creation has to necessarily have power, otherwise it can't be created. So, a power of some kind it must be. And since the Absolute is the sole reality, the one origin of all things, this power must proceed from it, must have some relation with it, a connection, a dependence. For if it is quite other than the Supreme Reality, a cosmic imagination imposing its determinations on the eternal blank of the indeterminable, then the sole existence of an absolute Parabrahman is no longer admissible. There is then a dualism at the source of things. So I am saying this power must be coming from that indeterminable only, the absolute indeterminable. But if it is not, then there is a dualism. It can't be an absolute indeterminable, the highest. There has to be two. And that is, it corresponds to the Sankey philosophy. They have the Purusha and the Prakriti.
I find it very interesting that Mother said the first sign of the supramental would be power, not love.
Yes, power is absolutely essential, and there will be power there.
Yes.
Power, and a power that is guided by consciousness. And there is also necessarily Ananda also there. Yeah. The power appears in the physical, the spiritual planes of consciousness to a certain extent, but it is not as complete as in the supermind. Okay. So far it is quite other than the Supreme Reality. The Supreme Reality is constantly referring to the Satchidananda, which is featureless and eternal, infinite, featureless, immutable. A cosmic imagination imposing its determinations on the eternal blank of the indeterminable. So, this is the Sankhya philosophy. It's like you can consider this indeterminable as a white screen. Even white is determination. So, but it helps to understand what he's saying. So, we have a blank screen, no color, no form, no shape, but it's infinite. It doesn't even have a border. It's a cinema screen. Now the world, the power is going on creating and throwing what it is creating, the images, onto the screen. This is the philosophy of the Sankhya's. Purusha is static. Prakriti is going on creating and throwing its images on the indeterminable Purusha screen. That's what he's saying. And that is the reason why at our level we feel that our screen is identifying with the images. Our consciousness is identifying with the image that is the body-mind life. Your body-mind life is only creation of nature. Therefore, it is created by nature, force. And these creations, it is throwing on the screen of the soul, and the soul is thinking, this is what I am.
And yet we have the idea of illusion
Ah,
on this screen. That it's not.
that comes when the screen separates itself from the images. Okay. The soul is the screen.
Okay.
And the images that are created, your body mind life is an image. And Prakriti is creating these images and throwing on and you are identifying it. The screen is identifying itself with the pictures. That's the Sankey philosophy. Okay. For if it is quite other than the supreme reality, a cosmic imagination imposing its determinations on the eternal blank of the indeterminable, then the sole existence of an absolute Parabrahman is no longer admissible. There is then a dualism at the source of things, not substantially different from the Sankhya dualism of soul and nature. So, this truth of Sankhya can be experienced at the lower levels, not in the supermind. When you go to the supermind, the Sankhya philosophy is not valid. It becomes, Purusha and Prakriti become one. But at the lower levels, they are eternally different. They are in contact with each other, but they are different. That's what he has told you in the previous para. He has told you that in the spiritual planes of consciousness, this dichotomy is sharply there. Dichotomy between spirit and matter.
Between higher mind and
higher mind,
overmind.
element mind, intuitive mind, overmind.
Yeah.
In these four planes, the dichotomy exists. The dichotomy exists, but it disappears in the supermind. In the overmind, the highest of these planes, the dichotomy is there, but it is not contradictory, it is complementary. It's another aspect of the same reality. But in the supermind, not even complementary, they become one. Consciousness is power, consciousness is Ananda, consciousness is substance. Okay? So, if it is a power, and Shivda is always talking of if, okay? But they do correspond to actual philosophies which are at different levels. Okay? If it is a power, the sole power indeed of the Absolute, we have this logical impossibility that the existence of the Supreme Being and the power of His existence are entirely opposite to each other, two supreme contradictories. For Brahman is free from all possibility of relations and determination, but Maya is a creative imagination imposing these very things upon it, an originator of relations and determinations, of which Brahman must necessarily be the supporter and witness to the logical reason and inadmissible formula. If it is accepted, it can only be as a supra-rational mystery, something neither real nor unreal, inexplicable in its nature, anirvachaniya. This is what Shankara says, that it is inexplicable. It is true that the two contraries are there, but you can't explain logically, you can't explain. Anirvachaniya, that which cannot be put into words. Okay. But the difficulties are so great that it can be accepted only if it imposes itself irresistibly as the inevitable ultimate, the end and summit of metaphysical inquiry and spiritual experience. It may be inexpressible, it may be something that the mind can't understand, but if it is an experience in spiritual experience and also you're in metaphysical inquiry, you have to accept it. That's what it is. For even if all things are illusory creations, they must have at least a subjective existence, and they can exist nowhere except in the consciousness of the soul existence. Soul exists, he is using different words. Soul existence, absolute reality, and the highest plane of existence. For even if all things are illusory creations, they can exist nowhere except in the consciousness of the soul existence. You got it?
Yes.
Yeah. they are then subjective determinations of the indeterminable. If, on the contrary, the determinations of this power are real creations, out of what are they determined? What is their substance? It is not possible that they are made out of a nothing, a non-existence other than the absolute, for that will erect a new dualism, a great positive zero over against the greater indeterminable x we have supposed to be the one reality. It is evident, therefore, that the reality cannot be a rigid indeterminable. That's his final conclusion. Whatever is created must be of it and in it, and what is of the substance of the utterly real must itself be real. A vast, baseless negation of reality, purporting to be real, cannot be the sole outcome of the eternal truth, the infinite existence. It is perfectly understandable that the absolute is and must be indeterminable in the sense that it cannot be limited by any determination or any sum of possible determinations, but not in the sense that it is incapable of self-determination. The supreme existence cannot be incapable of creating true self-determinations of its being, incapable of holding a real self-creation or manifestation of in its self-existent infinite. It's a huge para and very, very mysterious para. So we can deal with it in several ways, but one will be to simplify the language and look at what the core is saying, which means that I read out the summary in simpler words.
Where would we begin? If it is a power?
No, I am reading out the summary of what he said in the para.
Oh, okay.
Okay? In gist, we will get the gist. Then we will go into the arguments. If this absolute is indeterminable, immutable, it cannot produce a universe. It's very clear. If you suppose that this absolute is the highest and immutable, it cannot mutate, so therefore it is static. It can't create. How can something which is static, without the power of movement, create? It can't create.
And
it's a supposition.
And yet, yogis have gone into the nirguna.
Yeah, that's right. He says, but this is a supposition, but the world exists.
Right, but
that's
the world is there, yeah.
Yet, the universe exists. What then creates this opposition? That's what he has to solve the problem. The absolute is certainly a power which is ultimately related to the absolute. Otherwise, we have two ultimate principles, which is the Sankey theory. So, he started with an if. So, if it is like that, then it cannot produce. But the world exists, therefore that if supposition it cannot be held. You have to change it, modify it. That's what he's saying. Okay? And that corresponds to the Sankey theory. There is a power and an absolute consciousness. But if power is of the absolute, again we have a logical impossibility. And immutability cannot be the mutable cosmos. So, it cannot be that the highest immutability has become the cosmos. So, it cannot be the same. There has to be another. So, we come again to a duality. There is a static condition and there is a dynamic condition. There is spirit and there is matter. And the two don't have anything much in common. They are ultimate principles, all suppositions. And the problem is that at every level, these suppositions are actual experiences.
Oh.
That's right. The Sankey philosophy is valid. At the higher mind level, illumined mind level, it is valid. But when you go into the highest consciousness, it is not valid anymore. This we have discussed many times. Each level of consciousness, there are laws that operate there which are not applicable in the other regions, neither below nor above. Okay? So your views go on changing. What you think is real here, it goes on changing. But if the power is of the absolute, again we have a logical impossibility. An immutability cannot be the mutable cosmos. If we accept this position, we have an ineffable mystery. Anirvachaniya. So, if we accept this, that there is an absolute but there is also power, how to explain? We can't explain. Okay? So,
And again, he uses if it is accepted.
that's right. But if the universe is real, it must be a creation of the absolute. He is showing you how it's impossible for the mind to understand what it is. So, but if the universe is real, it must be a creation of the absolute, because that's only reality, the absolute reality. What then is the substance of this universe? If it is real, out of what is it built? That's what he's asking. Okay, so if the universe is real, it must be the creation of the absolute. What then is the substance of the universe? Given that the absolute is immutable and indeterminable and nothing, how can a nothing create something? Okay? The solution lies in the fact that the absolute is indeterminable but is not limited by its immutability. It is free from indeterminability as well as its mutability. That's what it is. It is free from both. In other words, the absolute cannot be fixed. You cannot say that it is only this. What we discussed just now, the moment you describe the divine as being omnipotent, you are limiting him. So, he is indeterminable, but he is not bound to his indeterminability. That's the explanation that he is giving. So, that can be experienced at another level. So, all these things are possible. If the absolute indeterminability is really permanently static, it can't produce a universe. Because if it produces a universe, then we have started with the Advaita philosophy that there is only one ultimate reality. So, if we say that it is immutable and indeterminable, it cannot create the universe, but the creation exists. Therefore, our idea, we must change our idea of what is the absolute. It is not bound by its indeterminability. It can also be, it is free from indeterminability and also its determinability. It is capable of both. That's what he's saying.
We have a line in Savitri, to fix the eternal, to fix the eternal in things that pass.
That's right. The divine presence in everything, and that is static, but the forms that go on passing away. And the divine presence here behind them, which is static and permanent. Everything in the physical world is only form and representation, but behind that is the divine presence supporting it. That's what it means. Overmind then gives us no final and positive solution. So, he is going step by step. And in the overmind consciousness, you don't have a solution because you see the dichotomy. He has told you that earlier in the previous para. From higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, even at the overmind level, there is both Purusha and Prakriti, spirit and matter, but they seem to be separate. Both are real, but they seem to be separate. Okay? So, overmind then gives us no final and positive solution. It is in a supramental cognition beyond it that we are left to seek for an answer. The supramental truth consciousness is at once the self-awareness of the infinite and eternal, and a power of self-determination inherent in that self-awareness. The first is its foundation and status. The second is its power of being, the dynamics of its self-existence. We'll have to see exactly what he means by self-existence and all that. Now we are only reading the para. All that a timeless eternity of self-awareness sees in itself as truth of being, the conscious power of its being manifests in time eternity. To supermind, therefore, the supreme is not a rigid indeterminable, an all-negating absolute, an infinite of being, complete to itself in its own immutable purity of existence, its sole power, a pure consciousness able only to dwell on the being's changeless eternity, on the immobile delight of its sheer self-existence, is not the whole reality. The overmind is not the whole reality. The infinite of being must also be an infinite of power, containing in itself an eternal repose and quiescence. It must also be capable of an eternal action and creation. But this too must be an action in itself, a creation out of its own self, eternal and infinite, out of its own self, eternal and infinite, since there could be nothing else out of which it could create. Any basis of creation seeming to be other than itself must be still really in itself and of itself, and could not be something foreign to its existence. An infinite power cannot be solely a force resting in a pure inactive sameness, an immutable quiescence. It must have in it endless powers of its being and energy. An infinite consciousness must hold within it endless truths of its own self-awareness. These in action would appear to our cognition as aspects of its being, to our spiritual sense as powers and movements of its dynamics, to our aesthesis as instruments and formulations of its delight of existence. Creation, then, would be a self-manifestation. It would be an ordered deploying of the infinite possibilities of the infinite.
Of the, yes.
So he started with the, if the absolute is immutable, then he says that you have a problem. So we have to change our condition. We can't say that the absolute is immutable. It must contain the possibility of mutability. It cannot be absolutely indeterminable. It must have the capacity to create the it can mutate itself into forms. That's what he's saying. Overmind then gives us no final and positive solution. He has told you that up to the overmind level, from higher mind, determinate mind, intuitive mind and overmind, the dichotomy exists. There is a duality. There is consciousness and there is power. There is Purusha and there is Prakriti. There is Saguna and Nirguna. Nirguna is the static, Saguna is the dynamic. Nirguna is the qualityless and the Saguna is the infinite qualitied. So these two seem to be contrary to each other, but in the overmind consciousness they are not contrary, but yet they are two different things. But according to Sri Aurobindo, we have started with the Advaita philosophy. So this is obviously not the final. There must be something else in which they become absolutely one. Overmind then gives us no final and positive solution. It is in a supramental cognition beyond it that we are left to seek for an answer. This is very, very descriptive of his own condition. In 1926, when he realized the overmind consciousness, he had a theoretical knowledge about the supermind, because Vivekananda had told him everything about the supermind. He spoke to him for a long time. In one place he said 15 days another place is nearly a month. So he knew what the supermind would be. So when he had the overmind experience, he realized that it is not the supermind. So that's why he withdrew to get that down. And he put mother in charge. This sentence that we are reading now refers to his own life. Okay, very clearly. Overmind then gives us no final and positive solution. It's a supramental cognition beyond it that we are left to seek for an answer. A supramental truth consciousness is at once the self-awareness of the infinite and eternal. Self-awareness, it's fully conscious of itself. And a power of self-determination inherent in that self-awareness. Chit and Shakti, consciousness and power, are involved in each other. That's what he's saying. In the overmind consciousness, they are not involved in each other. They are both exist, but they seem to be separate. Okay? A supramental truth consciousness is at once the self-awareness of the infinite and eternal, and a power of this of self-determination inherent in that self-awareness. Self-awareness, Chit. Self-determination, you can make forms out of it. Power of self-determination. The first is its foundation and status. There you are. Foundation and status. The second is its power of being, the dynamics of the self-existence. In other words, Purusha and Prakriti, spirit and matter, are involved in each other and imply each other at the highest level. They are not different. If you go beyond the overmind, that's what you see. That's what you see. All that a timeless eternity of self-awareness sees in itself as truth of being, the conscious power in being manifests in time eternity. So, let's try and understand the sentence. All that a timeless eternity of self-awareness. In that consciousness, there is no time. So, therefore, it is timeless. And it is infinite and eternal. That much is clear. Of self-awareness sees in itself, because it's the only thing that exists. Therefore, it looks into itself and sees in itself. What does it see? It sees truth of being. The conscious power of its being manifests in time eternity. So when consciousness looks into itself, it sees its possibilities and it tells its own power, create these forms which are there inherent in me. That's what he's saying. Consciousness itself does not create. It delegates its power, its own power, to create. I will support you in what you are creating, but you do the creation. And Prakriti, the power, creates for the enjoyment of the Purusha. That's what he's saying. He's not saying that here, but that's what he's implying. Yeah, the first is his foundation and status. This is clear. Note the word status. In immutability, status. Okay. The second is his power of being, the dynamics of its self-existence, the mutable. That's the immutable and this is the mutable. They imply each other. All that a timeless eternity of self-awareness sees in itself as truth of being, the conscious power of its being manifests in time eternity. All that is inherent in consciousness, the power is executing and making them manifested. That's what he's saying. Manifests in time eternity. So that is the timeless eternity and this is the time eternity. Clear, na? The highest level is timeless eternity and the physical world is time eternity. It is eternal, but it's in time. There is a flow because there is dynamics. It is dynamic. There is movement. There is no movement. This truth also we can also see in another way. Ramakrishna says that the sea of consciousness, sea of Satchidananda, When it is static, it's the highest level. You can say it's God. But when it starts moving, it creates waves, and that's the universe. Same thing in non-movement is the divine, and same thing in movement is the world.
A beautiful passage in the synthesis. All that is He, and He is the more than all that is.
Yes.
And we, though we know it not, are being of His being, conscious with a consciousness derived from His.
That's
It's a fantastic passage.
I read the next sentence. To supermind, therefore, the supreme is not a rigid indeterminable and all-negating absolute. Whereas in the spiritual planes of consciousness, you see that you are in the chit consciousness, but the physical world is unreal. It's not an all-negative absolute. The illusions that you see in the spiritual planes of consciousness disappear in the supermind. It's not an all-negating absolute. To supermind, therefore, the supreme is not a rigid indeterminable, an all-negating absolute, an infinite of being, complete to itself in its own immutable purity of existence, its sole power, a pure consciousness able only to dwell on the being's changeless eternity, on the immobile delight of its sheer self-existence, is not the whole reality.
Long sentence,
We'll
but
read that sentence again.
clear.
To supermind, therefore, the supreme is not a rigid indeterminable. Okay? So we started with the if. The absolute is indeterminable, but in the supermind, it is not so. That's what he's saying. The supermind, therefore, to supermind, therefore, the supreme is not a rigid indeterminable, an all-negating absolute. Because in the overmind consciousness also you can have the idea of the world being mere images and mere illusions. But in the supermind, no, it's not like that. An infinite of being, complete to itself in its own immutable purity of existence. He is referring to Sat. Okay? An infinite of being, complete to itself in its own immutable purity of existence. He is using the word infinite of being, and he is also using the word existence, which means he is referring to Sat, which is immutable and it is absolutely pure. That means it is one. So very clearly he is referring to Sat. Its sole power, a pure consciousness, able only to dwell on the being's changeless eternity. So the power is a pure consciousness. Its sole power, a pure consciousness, able to dwell on the being's changeless eternity, on the immobile delight of its sheer self-existence. He is giving you consciousness and Ananda also. An immobile delight of its sheer self-existence is not the whole reality.
So all this refers back to the supermind.
Yeah.
To supermind.
Is
all
not
these
the whole
thi-
reality.
Yes.
That's right. Okay? All these things are not the whole reality. The infinite of being must also be an infinite of power. There you are. This is what he is stating. Containing in itself an eternal repose and quiescence, it must also be capable of an eternal action and creation. It cannot be only immutability. It must also have the power to create and be mutable. Okay? So, the infinite being must also be an infinite of power, containing in itself an eternal repose and quiescence. It must also be capable of an eternal action and creation. But this too must be an action in itself, not outside itself, because there is only oneness. Okay? In itself. A creation out of its own self-eternal and infinite, out of its own self, eternal and infinite, since there could be nothing else out of which it could create. There is only oneness. any basis of creation seeming to be other than itself must be still really in itself and of itself and could not be something foreign to its existence. An infinite power cannot be solely a force resting in a pure inactive sameness, an immutable quiescence. The power can be static, but it must also have the power to become movement. That's what he's saying. It cannot be only a quiescence and cannot be only an immutability. It must have in it endless powers of its being and energy. An infinite consciousness must hold within itself endless truths of its own self-awareness. The infinite consciousness cannot be static. It must also hold multiplicity. It is one, but it must hold all the possibilities of the many. That's what he's saying. These in action would appear to our cognition as aspects of its being, to our spiritual sense as powers and movements of its dynamism, to our aesthesis as instruments and formations of its delight of existence. Creation then would be a self-manifestation. It would be an ordered deploying of the infinite possibilities of the infinite. So essentially, whatever is there in the highest level is only expressing itself. It's an expression of itself. And he is saying action, sense and aesthesis. Okay, so action, the physical, sense, 1 second. Action. One, aspects of being, Sat and existence. Sense, powers and movements, Chit Shakti. Aesthesis, Ananda. So he is going back to the Satchidananda and saying all these things are not static conditions, but they hold in themselves the possibilities of creating the universe. That's what it is.